Hey, I'm Solomon. Welcome to the channel. So today we're going to build on some of the stuff we've covered in prior videos. In other videos, I've covered the Aqualithic, the Green Sahara, and the various inventions and technologies invented by Africans during the African wet phase, and the subsequent spread of those people from the Sahara and other regions of Africa into the Nile Valley. It's those Africans that are going to really start ancient Egyptian civilization. And it should be known, while there is, people very clear racial biases, for the most part, the academic consensus is that the ancient Egyptians were native black people from Africa. Ancient Egypt was a native African civilization. And no really respected scholar is going to tell you some magical race of people came into Africa and dropped off a civilization. That's not how civilizations are started. They're not snapped into existence. Ancient Egypt was a very long process that took thousands and thousands of years by Africans in the continent. And this is well known. This is the view held by some of the most respected archaeologists, Egyptologists, organizations, and universities in the world, whether that be Oxford or UNESCO. For example, here's a clip of Stuart Tyson Smith giving a talk at Harvard exactly about this topic. And if you've never seen this video, I highly recommend it. He talks about the extreme racism that used to permeate older Egyptology. He talks about the cultures of the Green Sahara, and he talks about the native blackness of the ancient Egyptians.
So to conclude, the question of race in ancient Egypt is of great importance in modern society because of Egyptology's central and profoundly disturbing role in the creation of a theory of scientific racism that justified the worst kinds of discrimination, especially in America. Egyptologists might object that many Egyptians, like you see on the left here, Nubians on the right, would disagree with this conclusion, and that's correct. But my point is about American and European constructions of race. By modern American systems of racial classification, the ancient and modern Egyptians would both fall into the category of Black African. As Ann Roth, following Bruce Williams, pointed out years ago, an ancient Egyptian transported to the American South in the days of segregation would not be allowed to sit at a Woolworths bar, would have to go to the back of the bus, would be barred from facilities reserved for whites. The same applies to most of the modern Egyptians and Nubians I know and have worked with. Even though they might not self-identify that way, all the evidence points to a broad continuity of both groups as Northeast African populations. And in the end, I'm the only person in these two photographs who would be welcome at a lunch counter at Woolworths or would be allowed to sit in the front of the bus and not have to surrender my seat to a white person. The power of acknowledging both Nubia and Egypt as African civilizations is that it destroys the logic of racism, especially American racism with its strongly polarizing view of blackness and whiteness drawn from slavery. Young observes perceptively that, and I quote, Egypt as the earliest civilization developed in Africa clearly represented the major potential stumbling block for the permanent inferiority of the Black race, which it was alleged had never created or produced anything of value. Similarly, Trafton points out that this debate lies at the heart of the often polarizing back and forth between mainstream and Afrocentric Egyptology. A hierarchy of race like that developed by Morton, Knott, and Glidden, and still deployed today by white supremacists, cannot be sustained if not one but two great Black civilizations arose in Africa at the dawn of history. It is therefore entirely appropriate and even necessary to confront constructions of race for Nubia and Egypt in the recent past and acknowledge both civilizations as African and Black, dispelling the myth of racial classification and ranking that have their genesis with Glidden and the beginnings of American Egyptology. Thank you.
So the Africanity of Egypt really isn't in question, and really hasn't been in question for decades. The Egyptians came from the Sahara, the Sudan, and other regions of Africa. They were a collection of several different Africans, whether that be West African, or East African, or Central African. They were a cacophony of several different Africans, just as they had been in the Sahara, that just simply moved into the Nile Valley. So it's not radical or controversial or wild to say that the ancient Egyptians were black people from other parts of the continent, because that's the truth of the matter. That's what the actual archaeological record says. With that being said, this video isn't really about Egypt per se, but it is about civilization and the Sahara, namely the migrations of Africans from sub-Saharan Africa deep into new regions of Europe and Asia. While I do cover this in previous videos, we're going to go more in depth about these migrations, with a heavy emphasis on the genetics, both the lineage left by these ancient African migrants, but also the actual physical remains of African peoples from the Neolithic, found everywhere from ancient Spain to ancient Pakistan. During the Neolithic, you're going to see massive migrations from Africa into these regions. For example, you'll find that East Africans migrate down the Red Sea hills into North Africa and into the Levant, then subsequently into Turkey and into Europe. And then you'll find that Western and Central Africans move up into the Sahara, into North Africa, into Southern Europe, into Turkey, and also into the Levant. During the Neolithic, there's a halo of black genetics and black people all around the African continent. You really can't escape black people during the Neolithic. Just to let you know, I'm going to use some clips from the older videos in this video, as a lot of this information is new to a lot of people. But there's about an hour of new content in this video. In this video, we're going to cover the Holocene out of Africa migrations. Let's get it. So, green Sahara periods are also out of Africa periods. It's these exact same conditions when Africans first left the African continent to populate the rest of the earth over 50,000 years ago.
Archaeologist Jeff Rose is trying to piece together the route taken by the first people out of Africa. He's looking for evidence where the journey began on the Arabian Peninsula.
Up until just a couple years ago, most archaeologists thought the great human expansion out of Africa occurred along this coastline. People called it coasting out of Africa, coastal migration, coastal express. The idea was they had become seafarers. They had somehow developed aquatic subsistence. They could fish, they could collect shellfish along the coast, and that then led to this colossal expansion into Asia and the rest of the world. If an African culture came to this place, they're going to leave evidence of that culture behind in their stone tool technology, and we should be able to see this. So it's testable.
In 2010, Jeff Rose got funding to excavate in Oman and find that evidence. Anything on the shore itself would have been washed away long ago. But in the hills behind the shore, he expected to find some sign of prehistoric human life.
Now, this mountain range here rises up pretty steeply from the coast. It is full of caves. It's like Swiss cheese. We just thought it's a foregone conclusion. It's just a matter of time, not if we find anything, but when we find anything. We dug a test pit over there, we dug one there, we dug one there, we dug one on the slope leading up to the cave. In each case, we went down really deep, as far as we could go. And in all that time, we found nothing. We never found a single artifact. I remember just sitting there and saying, that's it, forget it. Forget the coast, we need to go somewhere else. We need a completely different strategy.
The project was failing, so Jeff Rose headed inland. Over 100 miles from the coast, in the middle of the desert, he came across a dried-up riverbed.
This is the Wadi Gadoon, one of the biggest ancient river valleys in all of Arabia, perhaps. It's probably half a mile to the other side. It's dry now, but 100,000 years ago, this thing was full of water. All of Arabia was green, for that matter. It was covered in savannas and lakes, and you have this vast network of river valleys that run through this plateau.
He began to explore the hilltops above the ancient riverbed. And here, he found a field of flaked rocks.
So, like, this is the stuff I've been looking for all those years along the coast. This is called chert or flint, and it's the raw material that was essential to make the stone tools throughout prehistory. And the site like this is literally covered in a carpet of this material. Prehistoric tool makers would come to a site like this, they would bang away, make their stone tools, leave the refuse behind, and then go off down into the valleys where the water was. So this is a prehistoric workshop.
It was unmistakable. People had passed through here and hung around long enough to make thousands of tools. But who and when? The stones told him all he needed to know.
That is gorgeous. That is a classic Nubian point. This is the tool that was made by the first people that left Africa.
Nubian points came from a part of Africa now in modern-day Egypt. They were made about 100,000 years ago. If the same tools can be found in Oman, it suggests people were on the Arabian Peninsula at the same time. 100,000 years ago.
We're not looking at something that looks like it may have a similarity to an African technology. We're looking at the identical African technology.
If Africans were in Arabia 100,000 years ago, then people were migrating into Asia much earlier than archaeologists thought. 40,000 years earlier. But what drove them on into the unknown? Perhaps it was the climate. Today, northern Africa and Arabia are hot and dry. But 100,000 years ago, this region was very different. The deserts bloomed. The landscape was green. The world was in a wet phase.
The climate here is cyclical. So you have this monsoon system that's circulating through the Indian Ocean, and then every once in a while, it intensifies, it strengthens, and it pushes into the interior of Arabia. Rivers like this that were once dry were flowing again, and so it was almost like the highways were open, and they just filled them up.
It wasn't the beaches that lured people into Arabia, but the rivers, filled by monsoon waters.
What we realized was that people weren't interested in the coastline. They weren't these fishermen who had adapted a new technology and were moving along this new ecosystem. They were the same people as they were in Africa, and they were opportunistic. These river valleys would have been paradise, because not only is it the exact landscape that they already knew, it was also unoccupied, so there was nobody to compete with. Some of the qualities that we can see in these people, which we really haven't seen before in prehistory, is they're curious. There was no overpopulation, so they weren't forced out of Africa, but they would wake up every day on one side of the Red Sea and they'd look across, and at some point, somebody couldn't stand it anymore and had to go scratch that itch. I think it was this curiosity that was driving them, and I think that's what we are. That's the defining aspect of our species, is we want to know what's on the other side.
For the first peoples, the way into Asia was open. From Arabia, they migrated eastward into Central Asia, northern India, and beyond. They would have followed a network of rivers, natural corridors through the continent.
So, just as in the Paleolithic, where Africans migrated down into the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula, then onwards into other regions of Eurasia, in the Neolithic, we're going to see the exact same movements. These are known as the Holocene out of Africa migrations. And these are the second biggest migrations out of Africa since the initial out of Africa migration to populate the Earth. The Holocene begins with the end of the Younger Dryas, which was, of course, a sudden ice age event that had a dramatic effect on human population and animal species around the world. The end of the Younger Dryas marks the beginning of the Holocene, and also the start of the Holocene out of Africa migrations. So we're going to see massive migrations out of inner Africa and into Eurasia. It's important to know when these African migrations occur, the world looks very different than it does now. For one, there are far fewer people on the planet than there is currently. Currently, there are over 7.5 billion people on the planet. At the start of the Holocene, there were literally less than 4 million people on the entire planet. You could walk the length of whole states without running into a single human being. And two, the people of the Neolithic and the Mesolithic look very different than they do now in modern day. The Holocene out of Africa migrations begin about 15,000 years ago. The last large exodus out of Africa were the Aurignacian people who left Africa about 40,000 years ago and migrated into Europe.
They could have emerged earlier, as you saw already from the lecture of Ellison Brooks. And definitely many of the African inventions that Ellison showed us very clearly, and also Lynn Wadley in her lecture, already arrived. So the guys are arriving, colonizing Eurasia in the same way that the early settlers of North America from Western Europe arrived with all these inventions, were already made in Europe, and they bring them to this continent. And of course, immediately they have an advantage over the local people. So, no surprisingly, the story will be continued. Okay. Now, to start the story again from the archaeology, we go back to Egypt, where the site of Taramsa show clearly the industry, which is known as the Nubian Mousterian, making a way for the early blade industries in the Levant, whether it is Ksarakil, Boker Tahtit, or the Emiran, makes no difference. I think I suggested this in 2000. Now, more of the local guys who work there accept it. Around 50,000 years ago, they moved into the Levant, only later to the Caucasus, straight into Europe, all across Europe, and because they came as different groups, their identity was not the same. It's not like a mass migration, but a migration of different groups going all the way into Western Europe, not reaching everywhere. Okay. And you can see some examples, the Bohunician in the Czech Republic, which we published long ago with Jiří Svoboda, and the material from Krakow, or the material from the Holocene, and so on. So there are different groups, and the work of Shara Bailey and Jean-Jacques Hublin clearly demonstrated that the teeth of these modern humans differ from one place to another, especially when you compare them to the Neanderthal teeth, which is much more keeping their unique character. So once we are dealing with different groups of people, they penetrate into the region, and what they do, they cause the retreat of the Neanderthals, because they take the better areas, probably by using better hunting tools like bows and arrows and so on, all the inventions that came from Africa. The Neanderthals retreat to the north, and they retreat to the south. And then through different processes, including decrease in total fertility rate, etc., without going into the details, they slowly disappear.
So there's only about 25,000 years between the initial out of Africa migrations and the Holocene out of Africa migrations. So a lot of people still look very similar to how they looked when they first left out of Africa. A lot of them still having their native black skin. This is especially true for Europeans such as the Aurignacian people, as the alleles for light skin are only about 20,000 years old, and that's in the Caucasus in Central Asia. Most Southern Europeans didn't turn white till about 5,000 years ago, and that's from migrations in the Caucasus coming down into Europe. So the first Europeans were black. These are the Aurignacian people, and they migrated out of Africa about 40,000 years ago. They're also sometimes called Cro-Magnon or Western hunter-gatherers. So for tens of thousands of years, the people of Europe were just black. This is a bust of an individual from 35,000 years ago from Romania. Quite a handsome dude. This is Grimaldi man, who was one of the oldest inhabitants of Europe. Grimaldi people were very short, only about 5 feet or so, very similar to the pygmies and Khoisan of Africa. Their connection to the Khoisan is not too surprising, as the Khoisan have been the biggest population on Earth for most of demographic history. This is Kotinsky man from Russia, around 30,000 years old. So the first Europeans are black, having the exact same skin color as many modern West Africans. To quote Zhu et al., the genetic scores of the oldest individuals in the dataset fall within the range of present-day West African populations, showing that early Upper Paleolithic Europeans, 50,000 to 20,000-year-old individuals such as Ust Ishim, carried few of the light-skin pigmentation alleles that are common in present-day Europe. And this would be the norm for much of European history, reaching deep into the Neolithic, and can be seen with several Neolithic individuals.
This is what people looked like in Western Europe and Britain 10,000 years ago, not what we would have expected.
1, 2, 3, come on!
In museums, reconstructions, they look a bit like this guy has a spark to him as well.
I'm Chris Stringer, and I'm a research leader in human origins at the Natural History Museum in London. And I'm holding here this wonderful reconstructed head of Cheddar Man. And I've been studying the skeleton of Cheddar Man for some 40 years or so. And now with DNA technology, we've got the whole genome of Cheddar Man. And here we've got a scientific reconstruction of what he looked like. We've got his hair form, his skin, his blue eyes, and that dark skin colour, that combination really striking. And getting out of here information about his biology, the fact that, for example, he couldn't digest milk because that came in with the advent of farming after the time of Cheddar Man. So we're getting his whole biology, how he relates to people in Europe at the time, and how he relates to people in Britain now.
Most Europeans received that typical white phenotype relatively recently, only within the last 5,000 years. This drastic change from dark skin to light skin being caused by massive migrations from the Caucasus and Central Asia, bringing not only the alleles for light skin, but also the Indo-European languages. So, of course, as the majority of people in Europe don't have the alleles for light skin, neither do Neolithic Africans. And of course, the native peoples of Egypt, like the native peoples of Central Africa, or Eastern Africa, or Southern Africa, or the Sudan, are of course black Africans. This is Nazlet Khader man, who lived in Upper Egypt about 35,000 years ago. Both Upper Egypt and the Sudan represent a black African continuum going back over 100,000 years. Two of the most important cultures of the Nile Valley Mesolithic were the Kadaanian and the Sibyllian, both of which are going to be especially important when we talk about migrations out of Africa and into the Levant and new regions of Eurasia. During the Mesolithic, the Sibyllian and Kadaanian cultures proliferated throughout Nubia and Egypt, both cultures originating in Nubia, the Sibyllian stretching from Kenna in Upper Egypt to Wadi Halfa in Sudan, where the Kadaanian stretched from Aswan in Nubia to Wadi Halfa in Sudan. Both are notable for being proto-agricultural. We see the collecting of grains and the use of sickles to harvest plants, the planting of seeds for crops, and many practices that predate the official beginning of agriculture in the Levant. Around 10,000 BC, these ways of life would be totally uprooted. And this has to do with dramatic shifts in Africa's environment, leading to the once docile and predictable Nile becoming a raging torrent. This was known as the Wild Nile, and this drastic climate change would have a profound effect on the people of the Kadaanian and the Sibyllian, both cultures disappearing around 10,000 BC. To understand exactly where these early Nubian cultures went to, we have to understand what state the world was in before the African wet phase. Before 10,000 BC, the world was in the grips of the Younger Dryas, a rather sudden event that caused massive climate change and a return to Ice Age conditions for many places around the world. These very sudden cold and dry conditions led to several extinctions of animal species, the disappearance of certain human cultures, and a major reduction in population overall. During this time, the Sahara Desert is much larger, hotter, and drier than it is today. There is little to no evidence of human activity in the Sahara or Arabia at this time, both being uninhabited. For instance, in the Caucasus Mountains, the last human presence was recorded 70,000 years ago. It's important to know, while these colder conditions had a severe effect on North Africa and in general the northern half of the planet, in the interior of Africa, along the Sudan Belt, which consists of Western Africa, Eastern Africa, and Central Africa, they were largely unaffected by these climate shifts. This is going to be huge for world history, as the Green Sahara is going to literally open up the floodgates, allowing these Africans to not only repopulate affected areas of Africa, but affected areas all around the world. The Green Sahara period is the largest out of Africa event since the initial out of Africa event 50,000 years ago, when people first populated the earth. It's best considered as Out of Africa Part 2. To understand this period, we have to start here, West Africa, Nigeria, in the village of Defuna. The year is 1987, and a farmer named Malam Yao is digging a well, and at a certain depth he hits something hard in the earth, his shovel making a loud thud. He goes to tell his village elder, and what the two men find is one of the greatest discoveries in world history. This is the Defuna canoe. It is 8,500 years old. It is the oldest boat ever found in Africa and the second oldest boat ever found in the world. The discovery is not only important for the antiquity of the find, but for the pronounced sophistication of the vessel. The boat shows a sleek, aerodynamic design, the front and rear shaped into perfect points to cut into the wind and water. The sides of the boat are incredibly thin, only 5 centimeters thick. This well-engineered craft is in stark contrast to finds of a similar age that are little more than hollowed-out tree trunks. To quote Professor Brunig, the sides are barely more than 5 centimeters thick. The bow and stern are pointed, giving the boat a notably more elegant form than finds of a similar age from Mesolithic Europe, such as the dugout Pesse canoe from the Netherlands. It is highly probable that the Defuna canoe does not represent the beginning of a tradition, but that it was preceded by a long development and that the origins of water transport in Africa reach even further back in time. The Defuna canoe shows how innovative and resourceful these early West African people were. It also showcases how they traveled and traversed the vast interconnected waterways of Aqualithic Africa. To understand these migrations both within Africa and out of Africa, we have to understand a couple of things about African genetics. To do that, we have to start here, in East Africa. Between 17,000 and 15,000 years ago, the cold and dry climates of certain parts of Africa would start improving for the better. This would lead to major migrations of East Africans crossing down into the Red Sea hills into other parts of Africa. And these Africans would be carrying the Y haplogroup known as E1B1. They would head down the Red Sea hills, into the Sudan, into Egypt, into the Levant, and this is going to be particularly important later, and into North Africa. Aside from E1B1, to fully understand African migrations in and out of Africa, we have to go here, back to West Africa. As early as 22,000 years ago, a child was born in the wet, tropical regions of West Africa. In these environments, human beings are plagued by mosquitoes who can carry the deadly disease malaria. But this boy was born with a special power, a mutation, that allowed him to defeat the mosquito's deadly disease. That mutation was known as sickle cell, which caused his red blood cells to take a rigid sickle shape. If he was infected, it allowed his immune system enough time to defeat the infection. As this boy grew and outlived those who did not have his mutation, he passed on his genes. As his genes proliferated, allowing people to survive in malaria-ravaged areas, a complication occurred. This complication was known as sickle cell anemia. This occurs when both your mother and your father both carry the alleles for sickle cell. When both parents have the trait, it leads to an overabundance of sickle blood cells, causing extreme pain and a lifetime of health issues. While sickle cell anemia is usually thought of as a black person's disease, it is actually spread out around the world. In India, there are millions of cases. In Iraq, in Iran, in the Levant, in the Mediterranean, all places that saw large migrations of Africans during the Neolithic. Every one of those people is of a West African lineage. Every one of them is descended from that one boy in West Africa. There are 4 main branches of sickle cell, each haplotype named after where they occur most frequently, namely the Benin haplotype, the Senegal haplotype, the Cameroon haplotype, and the Arab Indian haplotype, which, while named that, is simply the East African variant of sickle cell, which arose from people migrating from West Africa to East Africa, and subsequent migrations from there into the Middle East and India. To quote Schreiner et al., the occurrence of this haplotype in the Luya in Kenya and its clustering with the predominant haplotype found in Kenya and Uganda are consistent with the hypothesis that the Arab Indian haplotype originated in Africa and had an overseas migration route from Eastern Africa to Eastern Arabia and then into India. In contrast, the absence of the Benin haplotype in the Luya in Kenya and the Baganda in Uganda provides evidence against an overseas migration route from Eastern Africa to Western Arabia. Instead, the presence of the Benin haplotype in Western Arabia is consistent with an African origin and an overland migration route through Northeast Africa. So let's start with the first big migration out of Africa during the Neolithic. And that's the movement of East Africans bearing E1B1 into the Levant. So who lived in the Levant before these Africans arrived? Well, the Levant is the doorway to Africa. It's the gateway that many people took out of Africa to populate the earth. These early Levantines were called Cabarans. And we know from genetics that these early Levantines were basal Eurasian. What is a basal Eurasian? Well, that simply means an unmixed version of the original peoples that populated Europe and Asia. What is that in layman's terms? Well, that's a black person. It's an African. Remember, Africans populated Europe and Asia. They're like the Org Nation people. Remember, they came out of Africa and populated Europe. Those first Org Nation people were basal Eurasian, and the Cabarans were just as black as those first Org Nation people. So the Cabarans would have been related to and looked very similar to early Org Nation people, but unlike the Org Nation, they never mixed with any Neanderthals. They had 0 Neanderthal admixture. The only modern and ancient populations that have 0 Neanderthal admixture are black people, are Africans. To simplify, imagine what Solomon Islanders look like, or Andaman Islanders, or a native person from Indonesia. These are all natives. They're unmixed versions of the first people that moved in those areas. Remember, the Org Nation people did not lose their black skin till about 5,000 years ago, when people started migrating in from Central Asia, from the Caucasus. So the Cabarans, the early Levantines, they were just black people that never left the doorstep of Africa. They're just Org Nation people that stayed put instead of kept migrating. In fact, prior to being called the Cabarans, they were called the Levant Org Nation because of their shared toolkits and culture. They're a part of that same out-of-Africa population, but instead of leaving to Europe or Asia, they just chilled right on the doorstep of Africa. Then, at about 15,000 BC, you have East Africans migrating into the Levant, bringing haplogroup E into this ancient African population. E1B1 sits on the Y chromosome and is passed down from father to son. So you have these African men intermarrying with these women from this very ancient out-of-Africa population. So it's the mixture of these two ancient African populations that will become the Natufians. And not surprisingly, all successor Levantine populations will bear the haplogroup E. They're all descended from those East Africans. There was also subsequent migrations from other Africans through the Levant. This is why there's such a prevalence of sickle cell anemia in the Levant and throughout the Fertile Crescent. The dominant haplotype found throughout the Levant is the Benin or Nigerian haplotype, found in Nazareth, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, and in both Muslim and Jewish populations. To quote Rund et al. On a paper they wrote on sickle cell anemia amongst Jewish families in Israel, The present results show that the Jewish family carries the sickle mutation on the background of the Benin haplotype, tracking that sickle cell chromosome back to Central West Africa. The absence of red cell markers suggests the migration of the sickle chromosome probably occurred many generations ago. This is also backed up by recent studies on Jewish populations that are all fairly dispersed. They all contain ancient strains of sub-Saharan African DNA. To quote Morjani et al., a striking finding from our study is the consistent detection of 3 to 5% sub-Saharan African ancestry in the 8 diverse Jewish groups we studied: Ashkenazis from Northern Europe, Sephardis from Italy, Turkey, and Greece, the Mizrahis from Syria, Iran, and Iraq. A parsimonious explanation for these observations is that they reflect a history in which many of the Jewish groups descend from a common ancestral population, which was itself admixed with Africans prior to the beginning of the Jewish diaspora that occurred in the 8th to 6th century BC. The Africanity of the Natufians is also borne out in the actual craniofacial analysis of their skulls, and they bear a very black and African appearance, which is not surprising at all. To quote C. Lawrence Brace and al., the Epipaleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. In this figure, one can see the clear link between the Niger-Congo sample and the Natufians. The prehistoric and recent Northeast African sample also has a subsequent link to the Niger-Congo sample in figure 3. The assessment of prehistoric and recent human craniofacial dimensions supports the picture documented by genetics that the extension of Neolithic agriculture from the Near East westward to Europe and across North Africa was accomplished by a process of demic diffusion. If the late Pleistocene Natufian sample from Israel is the source from which that Neolithic spread was derived, then there was clearly a sub-Saharan African element present of almost equal importance as the late prehistoric Eurasian element. At the same time, the failure of the Neolithic and Bronze Age samples in Central and Northern Europe to tie to the modern inhabitants supports the suggestion that while a farming mode of subsistence was spread westward and also north to Crimea and east to Mongolia by actual movement of communities of farmers, the indigenous foragers in each of those areas ultimately absorbed both the agricultural subsistence strategy and also the people who had brought it. The interbreeding of the incoming Neolithic people with the in situ foragers diluted the sub-Saharan traces that may have come with the Neolithic spread, so that no discoverable element of that remained. This picture of a mixture between the incoming farmers and the in situ foragers had originally been supported by the archaeological record alone, work cited 6, 9, 33, 34, 48, 49. But this view is now reinforced by the analysis of the skeletal morphology of the people of those areas, where prehistoric and recent remains can be metrically compared. The clustering of Natufian skulls with Niger-Congo people is not surprising in the least. As we know, West Africans are amongst the founding populations of the Levant, and some of the earliest Africans to migrate out the Green Sahara. The presence of these West African migrants in the ancient Levant is further substantiated by several other genetic vectors found in ancient remains from the Fertile Crescent. One such vector is the presence of human head lice, or Pediculus humanus capitis. These lice are subdivided into several significant divergent mitochondrial haplogroups, namely A, B, and C, each with a particular geographic distribution around the world. Thus, they are an excellent marker for older human migration events. To quote Drawley, lice are among the oldest parasites of humans, representing an excellent marker of the evolution and migration of our species over time. Here we analyze by real-time polymerase chain reaction developed in this study the mitochondrial DNA of 7 ancient head louse eggs found on hair remains recovered from 2 sites in Israel. One, 5 nits dating from Chalcolithic period, 4000 BC, were found in the Cave of the Treasure, located at Nahal Mishmar in the Judean desert, and two nits dating from the early Islamic period, circa 650 AD, were found in Nahal Omer in the Arava Valley between the Dead Sea and the Red Sea. Our results suggest that these eggs belong to people originating from West Africa, based on identification of the louse mitochondrial subclad specific to that region. A ML phylogenetic analysis performed for the CYTB gene showed that the ancient hairnets belonging to the Chalcolithic and early Islamic periods are part of clade C. Within clade C, these nits form a subclad with lice found in Senegal. Interestingly, this study reveals the presence of a mitochondrial genotype, clade C, in a Near East region that has thus far only been found in Africa, Ethiopia, and Senegal, and in Asia, Nepal. Specifically, these old nits are included in a subgroup in clade C comprising contemporary lice that are characterized only in West Africa. The presence of this genotype in the Near East is necessarily linked to migration flows of humans through the ages. The genetic information available today from humans suggests that significant gene flow most likely occurred within the past 2,500 years between sub-Saharan Africans and Near East populations. The presence of these sub-Saharan Africans in the ancient Near East is even further verified by the actual physical remains of ancient African individuals who lived throughout the Levant and the Near East during the Neolithic. These early members of the Neolithic Revolution migrating deep from within inner Africa. It should be known that the finding of ancient sub-Saharan individuals throughout Mesolithic and Neolithic sites in the Near East, Europe, and Asia is very common. As the Green Sahara period is the largest out-of-Africa migration since the initial out-of-Africa migration, the presence of these ancient African individuals amongst these early Neolithic sites is a regular occurrence and is well known and well documented. These ancient Africans constituting a large portion of these early Neolithic populations. To understand these movements and ancient remains, we have to understand a little bit about African genetics, namely the male paternal or Y chromosomal lineages of Africa. As we know, haplogroup E1b1b has its origins in East Africa. These East Africans migrating down the Red Sea Hills and into North Africa and the Levant at the very beginning of the Holocene. Not surprisingly, given the spread of these Africans, E1b1b would become the dominant paternal haplogroup of the early Natufians and is found abundantly amongst the ancient remains throughout the Levant. Another important haplogroup is E1b1a1. This Y chromosomal lineage has its origin in Western Africa, where it is the dominant Y paternal lineage of Bantu Niger-Congo people. This deeply ancestral African clade can also be found amongst the ancient sites of the Near East. Perhaps the most important of all African haplogroups is haplogroup A. This ancient paternal lineage originating in Western Central Africa almost 300,000 years ago. It's here in West Africa we find Y chromosomal Adam, the first of all men and the beginning of the human race. While the mitochondrial Eve, the ancestor or mother of all maternal lines and all women that walk the earth, can be found in East Africa, Y chromosomal Adam, the ancestor or father of all men and paternal lines that walk the earth, can be found in West Africa. It's here in West Africa we find A00, the beginning of all paternal lines of Africa and of all paternal lines of the human race, which is significantly older than the mitochondrial Eve. To quote Fernando L. et al., we report the discovery of an African American Y chromosome that carries the ancestral state of all SNPs that define the basal portion of the Y chromosome phylogenetic tree. We sequenced 240 kb of this chromosome to identify private derived mutations on this lineage, which we named A00. We then estimated the time for the most recent common ancestor of the Y tree as 338,000 years ago. These early West Africans, who were the first of all men, would eventually spread out over the entire African continent, populating every inch of Africa, to the Amara highlands of Ethiopia to the Blombos caves of South Africa. This Y chromosome is synonymous with sub-Saharan Africa, and today it is almost completely restricted to the African continent, found in its highest frequency amongst populations like the Khoisan and the Pygmies. The highest frequency of its most basal branches being found amongst the Bantu of Cameroon in western Central Africa, where this clade first emerged. This deeply ancestral African clade would also spread out during the age of the Green Sahara, where it is now found commonly in ancient remains from Europe and the Near East, speaking to the spread of these Africans from deep within the continent. Another important haplogroup is haplogroup DE, or haplogroup D and E. These two African Y chromosomal lineages have a particularly interesting history and distribution. DE, or D and E, are twin clades, or sibling clades. Both of these Y lineages being forever connected by a very special mutation, known as the YAP-positive polymorphism. Of all the Y chromosomes on the Earth, only D and E have this YAP-positive mutation, making them both YAP-positive, while all other Y chromosomes are YAP-negative. Upon the out-of-Africa migration, one single clade of D, D1, would exit out of the African continent to help populate the rest of the world, where E remained in Africa, where it is now the dominant Y haplogroup of the African continent. So, wherever in Africa the D lineage originates is also where the E lineage originates, both these two Y chromosomal clades being connected by that YAP-positive polymorphism. Thus, wherever D originates is where DE originates. There is one place in Africa you can find the D haplogroup, and that is here, its place of origin, West Africa, Nigeria. To quote Haber et al., here we reinvestigate a rare deep-rooting African Y chromosomal lineage by sequencing the whole genomes of 3 Nigerian men described in 2003 as carrying haplogroup DEY chromosomes, and analyzing them in the context of a calibrated worldwide Y chromosomal phylogeny. We confirm that these 3 chromosomes do represent a deep-rooting DE lineage, branching close to the DE bifurcation, but place them on the D branch as an outgroup to all other known D chromosomes, and designate the new lineage D0. The most favored model involves an origin of the DE lineage within Africa, and D0 and E remaining there, and migration out of the 3 lineages C, D, and FT that now form the vast majority of non-African Y chromosomes. The exit took place between 50,300 and 81,000 years ago, and most likely between 50,300 and 59,400 years ago. This work resolves a long-running debate about Y chromosomal out-of-Africa back-to-Africa migrations, and provides insight into the out-of-Africa expansion more generally. Thus, just as the original dominant Y chromosomal lineage of Africa, haplogroup A, originated in Western Central Africa, the current dominant Y chromosomal lineage of Africa also originated in Western Africa, splitting off from its YAP-positive sibling clade, haplogroup D, in ancient Nigeria, then migrating eastward into Ethiopia and to new regions. Remember, haplogroup A00 has its origins in Western Central Africa, and these people were the first to populate East Africa. Thus, these older A lineages that once dominated Ethiopia were largely replaced by these West African migrants, bringing the YAP-positive haplogroup E into these new regions of East Africa. To quote Cole et al., from the 20 main haplogroups in the Y chromosomal haplogroup tree, only 5 were detected in the analyzed Amharic population in Ethiopia. Haplogroup A is near the roots of the tree and is only found among males on the African continent. The major haplogroup detected was E. Haplogroup E has its origin in West Africa. Due to immigration, haplogroup A, which originally dominated in Ethiopia, has been partly replaced. And lastly, the last 2 important Y chromosome haplogroups are BT and CT. BT is defined by its mutations that distinguish it from A, but not necessarily from its children clades, B and CT. Its main branch is B, which is commonly found amongst the dense tropical regions of Africa in populations like the Mbuti or the Hadzabe. The immediate subclade of BT is CT, which is defined by its mutations that distinguish it from A and B, but not necessarily from its children clades DE and CF. Upon the out of Africa migration, D and E would remain in Africa, while a single branch of D, D1, and CF would migrate out of the African continent. All male lineages outside of Africa will descend from this single branch of D and the various subclads of CF. After the initial out of Africa migration, these ancestral African Y chromosome lineages will become restricted to the African continent and would not see wider distribution into the broader regions of Afro-Eurasia till the onset of the Holocene climatic optimum. With the greening of the Sahara, these populations were able to cross a newly greened Sahara into North Africa, into Europe, into Southwest Asia, and beyond, where they would prosper for millennia, and where they can now be found commonly amongst the ancient remains of the peoples of the Neolithic Revolution. One of the earliest African inhabitants of the Fertile Crescent can be found here in Mesolithic Iran. This individual was found laid to rest in Belt Cave near the Alborz Mountains of Iran. The remains of this Neolithic African individual dating to between 12,000 and 8,000 BC. Note, this is right around the time the Sahara had just transformed into a completely green oasis. This individual originated from Western Africa and bore the Y haplogroup E1B1A1 and is of course the dominant patrilineal lineage of Bantu Niger-Congo peoples. This gentleman certainly would have been an early vector for the spread of sickle cell anemia traits in these Near Eastern regions. This gentleman's specific patrilineal clade is E1B1A1A1C2B1, also known as Z6005. This sub-Saharan African clade can be found primarily in the far western ends of Africa, in regions such as Gambia and Senegal. Given the West Africans' prowess with boat building, having the oldest boat in Africa and the second oldest boat in the world, it's not at all surprising that these early West Africans were able to easily traverse the vast waterways of Aqualithic Africa and were already residing in regions of the Near East at such an early date in the Holocene. Another African individual dated to 9,100 and 8,600 BC was also found at this exact same site in the Belt Caves. This gentleman bearing haplogroup CT, this deeply ancestral sub-Saharan African lineage, is one of the oldest of mankind and is found commonly amongst the remains of the ancient Levant. Of course, the remains of East Africans are found prevalently throughout the Fertile Crescent, E1B1B being the predominant Y chromosome found amongst the remains of the ancient Natufians. Not surprisingly, as E1B1B is found abundantly amongst the ancient remains, some of the most basal forms of these ancient East African lineages can be found amongst the ancient peoples of the Levant. EP2 or E1B1 is one of the most basal branches of E in Africa and is actually the parent clade of E1B1B. Not surprisingly, its most basal branches can be found in highest frequency amongst the Beta Israel or the Ethiopian Jews of Africa. These African populations making up some of the earliest populations to live in Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon, migrating into these regions early on during the Holocene. The earliest individual found in the Near East bearing E1B1 can be found here at Rakfet Cave in Israel, dating back to 11,840 BC and 9,960 BC. And not surprisingly, several other individuals bearing E1B1B lineages can also be found at this exact same site. These ancient individuals, dating to between 11,840 BC and 9,760 BC, as well as there being several gentlemen bearing African haplogroup CT also laid to rest at this ancient site. These East African lineages would come to dominate the paternal gene pool of the Fertile Crescent for millennia to come. It should be known that many of these East African E lineages can still be found throughout these areas, stretching from Western Asia to Europe. It's these Neolithic African communities that first moved into the Levant that would eventually spread agriculture to both Europe and Asia. One commonly found E lineage still in these areas is EM78, this ancient African lineage, standing as a testament to these early African founders of the Neolithic Revolution. To quote Battaglia et al., Correlations between human occupation sites and radiocarbon dated climatic fluctuations in the Eastern Sahara and Nile Valley during the Holocene provide a framework for interpreting the main Southeast European centric distribution of EV13. A recent archaeological study reveals that during a desiccation period in North Africa while the Eastern Sahara was depopulated, a refugium existed on the border of present-day Sudan and Egypt near Lake Nubia until the onset of a humid phase around 8500 BC. The rapid arrival of wet conditions during the early Holocene period provided an impetus for population movement into habitat that was quickly settled afterwards. Haplogroup EM78 representatives, although rare overall, still occur in Egypt, which is a hub for the distribution of the various geographically localized M78 related subclades. The northward moving rainfall belts during this period could have also spurred a rapid migration of Mesolithic foragers northwards in Africa, into the Levant, and ultimately onwards into Asia Minor and Europe, where they each eventually differentiated into their regionally distinctive branches. These migrations of Africans bearing these M78 haplogroups is incredibly important when we talk about the development of agriculture. Remember, both the Cadonian and Sibyllian were both proto-agricultural. Both of these complexes located in and originating in Nubia, near Lake Nubia as Battaglia states. It's not surprising that shortly after these Africans bearing these M78 haplogroups migrated into the Levant, that we would see the official beginning of agriculture. These African migrants from the Middle Nile surely playing an important role in the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution. But it's not just African men that can be found predominantly amongst the ancient residents of the Near East and the Levant, but ancient African women as well. While the movement of males can be tracked with the movement of Y chromosomes, the movement of women can be tracked with mitochondrial DNA. Unlike Y chromosomes, which can only be passed down from father to son, mitochondrial DNA is passed down to both men and women, though it is only women that can pass it down to their children. Thus, while all men receive mitochondrial DNA from their mother, only women can pass it down. Thus, mitochondrial DNA is a fantastic tool for tracking migrations out of Africa, but it's also a fantastic tool for tracking migrations within Africa as well. It should be noted that one of the largest and earliest migrations within the African continent was the movement of Western and Central Africans into new regions of Eastern Africa at the very beginning of the Holocene. These West African migrants would come bearing the ancestral West African mitochondrial lineage known as L2. Today, this West African lineage is found in high percentage from Sudan to Ethiopia to Somalia, speaking to the genetic continuity across the African continent and the early spread of these Africans during the improved environment of the Holocene and the African wet phase. To quote Silva, mitochondrial DNA haplogroup L2 originated in Western Africa, but is nowadays spread across the entire continent. L2 movements were previously postulated to be related to the Bantu expansion, but L2 expansions eastwards probably occurred much earlier. By reconstructing the phylogeny of L2, we provide insights on the complex net of within African migrations in the last 60,000 years. Results show that lineages in southern Africa cluster with Western Central African lineages at a recent timescale, whereas eastern lineages seem to be substantially more ancient. 3 moments of expansion from a Central African source are associated with L2. One migration at 70 to 50,000 years ago into eastern or southern Africa. 2 post-glacial movements 15 to 10,000 years ago into eastern Africa. And 3 of the southward Bantu expansion in the last 5,000 years. Early Holocene gene flow between Central and Eastern Africa. In a previous study based on HVS1, a probable major migration of L2 lineages in the Pleistocene-Holocene transition was discerned. We reproduced the network analysis for the present HVS1 dataset, and the 3 main nodes detectable at HVS1 level showed founder ages between 7,000 and 15,000 years ago, supporting a movement into Eastern Africa substantially before the Bantu expansion. L0A also showed a similar pattern, but in the opposite direction, suggesting that bidirectional gene flow occurred between Central and Eastern Africa in the Pleistocene-Holocene transition period. Since phylogeographic inferences based on HVS1 alone can be misleading, we further tested the patterns with whole mitochondrial DNA genomes. From the 801 complete L2 sequences contemplated in our analysis, only 39 are from East Africa. Considering that 24 were sequenced in this study, it is evident how poorly this region was represented in past studies. L2 complete sequences, similar to the HVS1, indicate that most lineages arrived to Eastern Africa in the early Holocene or late Pleistocene. L2A1B contains Somali lineages whose founder age in Eastern Africa is 7.9 thousand years ago, and the Eastern African L2A1D1 dates to 10.6 thousand years ago. L2A1H, probably with Eastern African origin, dates to 14,000 years ago, while L2A1R, a newly labeled Somali clade, dates to 7.3 thousand years ago. Additionally, around 20% of Eastern African lineages cluster within the L2A1 143 branch. A founder age of this cluster suggests a migration time at 14,000 years ago, pointing to a migration in the late glacial or post-glacial period. Overall, as predicted by HVS1 data, most of the L2 lineages entered Eastern Africa between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago. A BSB restricted to Eastern Africa shows a population increase in the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. Despite the low number of Eastern samples, a signal of expansion was also visible at 10,000 years ago in the BSB containing Western Central African lineages, which could be expected considering that the migration of L2 lineages into Eastern Africa might have been triggered by an expansion of these lineages in the source. We extensively analyzed the phylogeography of major African mitochondrial DNA haplogroup L2. Following an origin in Western or Central Africa, L2 was involved at least in 3 movements out of Central Africa. One in the Pleistocene, at least 50,000 years ago, documented by the emergence of L2A5 either in Eastern or Southern Africa, whose arrival could match a period of climate change that could have also triggered the out of Africa migration and Eastern to Central African movements. Two, in the post-glacial period, comprising the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, a period that witnessed major changes in climate and vegetation, comprising mainly the expansion of L2A throughout Eastern Africa in the opposite direction of L0A haplogroup, and 3, in the late Pleistocene, L2 clades, mostly L2A clades, were deeply involved in the Bantu expansion to southern Africa. Thus, mitochondrial DNA is an excellent tool to track not only the movement of women, but men as well. And of course, as these African men migrated down into the Near East, they of course brought along wives. And even today, we can still see a large genetic footprint from these ancient African women who crossed the Green Sahara, who crossed the Red Sea Hills, and migrated into these new regions of the Near East. Note the extremely high frequency of these ancient African lineages in the Levant. These ancient African women playing a large part in these Holocene out of Africa migrations and in the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution. To quote Sa et al., the following 40,000 to 50,000 years witnessed little significant population movement within Africa, and variation accumulated regionally, likely due to a fragmented environment. However, the climatic changes introduced during the Holocene, with the peak of the Holocene climate optimum, allowed woodland and savanna adjacent to the Sahara to expand, creating conditions for the Sahel to become a major corridor, both north, south, and east-west. The expansion of L3 lineages in Eastern Africa and L2 lineages in West Africa attest to the rise in human mobility across the Sahel during this period of improved climate. Movements northwards of Eastern, Central, and Western populations also led to the arrival of sub-Saharan mitochondrial DNA lineages in North Africa and eventually Europe, which was most likely the largest movement of people from sub-Saharan Africa into Europe and Asia since the out-of-Africa migration. Following the out-of-Africa migration 60 to 70,000 years ago, significant numbers of sub-Saharan lineages did not disperse from the continent again until the early Holocene. At this time, the climate optimum and the consequent expansion of equatorial forests allowed movements that had previously been limited. Populations were able to cross a greener Sahara to North Africa and Southwest Asia, and from there into Europe, as suggested before, demonstrating the continuing role of climatic oscillations in shaping continental genetic structure. The genetic input from sub-Saharan populations into North Africa points to two major sources. One is West Africa, reinforcing the trans-Saharan movements made possible by the more favorable environmental conditions. The second is Eastern Africa, a likely source of pastoralism in this period. And of course, as these Africans spread into these new regions, they of course brought their native languages, chiefly the Afrasian or Afro-Asiatic languages, which has its origin in East Africa, between the regions of Ethiopia and Somalia in the Horn of Africa, being spoken by these early bearers of the E1B1 lineages. With the improved climate of the African wet phase, these Africans were able to spread out into new regions of Africa and Eurasia. Today, Afrasian or Afro-Asiatic is spoken everywhere from Nigeria to Israel to Sudan, with its greatest diversity, of course, being inside the African continent, as well as its oldest and most ancient branches, which can still be found in East Africa to this day. To quote Eric, moreover, the available genetic evidence relating in particular to the M35-215 E1B1 Y chromosome lineage also accords with just this kind of demographic history. This lineage had its origin broadly in the Horn of Africa and East Africa. It then spread to Egypt in the eras before farming. From there to the areas of the Levant, where the pre-Proto-Semitic branch of the Afrasian family would come to be spoken, and also to North Africa and the Sahara, where it is now common among Amazigh speakers in those regions. The distribution partially parallels, in other words, the history of the spread of the Afrasian language family, as described here. Origins in the Horn, a movement of people northwards to Egypt, bringing a new demic component of Horn of Africa origin into the existing populations of 17,000 years ago, with subsequent spreads of Afrasian speakers to the Levant and across North and Saharan Africa, bringing the same Y chromosome lineage to the existing populations of those regions. It really can't be overstated how important and significant these migrations are, especially when we take into account the actual amount of people that physically lived on the planet in that time. In 12,000 BC, at the beginning of the Holocene and the age of the Green Sahara, there was only about 4 million people on the entire face of the earth. And during the Younger Dryas, a large number of those people are going to be living inside Inner Africa, mostly unaffected by this Ice Age event that lasted almost 1,300 years. To put it in perspective, there are 39.54 million people currently living in California, just a single state in America. Just this one state has 10 times the amount of people that lived on the entire face of the planet at the start of the Holocene. For example, there are almost 4 million people living in San Diego County, a single county in Southern California. Just this one county in this one state in this one country could house the entire human population at the beginning of the Holocene. It's important to keep this in mind. These African migrants are not migrating into densely packed areas. There simply isn't enough people on the planet. So it can't really be overstated how important these migrations are and just how different the world looked at this time. It's these populations that are going to create some of the earliest towns and settlements on the planet, as well as incredibly important sites like the Tower of Jericho and Göbekli Tepe. It's these populations that would go on to create agriculture and then eventually spread out to Europe and Asia. Africa and the Fertile Crescent during the Neolithic are best described as two pieces of the same puzzle, and during the Neolithic, the Levant is best described as an extension of Africa, both genetically, linguistically, and historically. So, in summation, the creators of the agricultural revolution were black people, the creators of Mesopotamia in Iraq, the creators of Elam in Iran. These were all Afro-Asiatic people of an African lineage. This is why when we look at the genetic trail from African migration into southwestern Asia during the Holocene, We see a mixture of different Africans, East Africans and West Africans and Central Africans, and so on. This is also why we see such a prevalence of sickle cell anemia in places like Iraq and Oman and Lebanon. This is also why Neolithic skulls from Iran also cluster with Niger-Congo samples, same as the Natufians. All these people were of an African lineage. They spoke an African language, Afro-Asiatic, and it wouldn't be till later, till people from Central Asia, from the Caucasus, migrated down into these areas and changed the genetics of these populations. This is why Neolithic and Bronze Age people in the Middle East and Southern Europe don't look like their modern counterparts. They've been thoroughly admixed over spans of millennia. Now that we've thoroughly covered African migrations into the Levant and Southern Asia, let's get into the African migrations into Southern Europe and North Africa. Before that, we have to understand who lived in North Africa before the Green Sahara. Well, we have to remember, during the Younger Dryas and even before that, the Sahara was even larger and hotter than it is today, so much of North Africa was uninhabited. Those few people that did live in North Africa eked out an existence along the coast of the Maghreb. One such coastal community was the people of Taforalt. DNA analysis has showed that they had a three-way African admixture, and that all males possessed the East African haplotype E1b1. Their genetics being one part Hadza, who are one of the oldest ethnic groups of East Africa, and it's only logical as we know East Africans migrated into the Sudan, into Egypt, into the Levant, and into North Africa. Natufian, most likely also contributing to that E1b1, we find so prevalently and logical being the proximity from the Levant to the Maghreb, and also West African, being most related to modern Mande and Yoruba, as well as representing a more basal West African lineage. That basal West African lineage is of special importance. Remember, basal means the original, the oldest branch. So why is this more or less isolated group living along the coast of North Africa so closely related to the more densely populated regions of West Africa? Well, that's because prior to the Green Sahara, the Sahara was of course a desert, but prior to that, it was once again a Green Sahara. This is back 50 to 60,000 years ago. These are the conditions when Africans first left out of Africa, and the people that lived in the Green Sahara and throughout Africa before the Great Exodus were called Artyrians. Artyrians originate in East Africa, but lived throughout North Africa, in places like Egypt, in Libya, but also throughout West Africa, in Niger, in Timasa, in Senegal. So 40,000 years ago, if I went to Senegal, the people are Artyrian. If I go to Niger, the people are Artyrian. If I went to Libya, the people are Artyrian. And if I went to Taforalt, the people were Artyrian. The people were all Artyrian because it's all one green garden. Nothing is separating these Africans from going wherever they want. But when that garden became a desert, those populations became separated. The Artyrians that lived in North Africa were cut off from the Artyrians that lived in West Africa. In West Africa, the Artyrians became me, the Mandinka, the Yoruba, the various ethnicities of West Africa. Even to this day, we still carry around a good amount of basal West African DNA, up to 12%, the exact same ancient strain that was in the people of Taforalt. An Artyrian is a basal West African. That's why the people in Taforalt have those genetics. The people that lived in North Africa and West Africa were at one time the same. The reason North African people don't look the same as West African people anymore is because the Sahara has been a desert for the last 5,000 years. They've experienced millennia of gene flow from Eurasia, as well as countless occupations and colonizations from the Arabs, the Ottomans, the Romans, the Vandals, and many more, while West Africa is largely unmixed. So when you see someone like Thomas Sankara from Niger, or Muammar Gaddafi from Libya, it's important to know both of these guys have the exact same lineage. They're both Artyrians. Gaddafi is just more mixed, while Sankara is closer to the original populations that would have lived in both North and West Africa. So that's who lived in North Africa prior to the last Green Sahara. They were a mixture of the indigenous late Artyrian, very similar to the Yoruba or the Mande that lived in West Africa, Natufian, and East African. With that being said, let's get into another key migration. While we know Africa began getting more humid as early as 17,000 years ago, the Green Sahara truly begins about 10,000 BC. That's when it is a complete oasis from south to north, filled with aquatic fauna and flora and massive lakes and waterways. This greening would lead to massive movements from inner Africa as Western and Central Africans moved deep into the newly green Sahara, as well as into North Africa. But they wouldn't stop there. As we know, West Africans are amongst the oldest boat builders in the world, having the oldest boat in Africa and the second oldest boat in the world. And it's precisely this technology that not only let them travel into North Africa, but allowed them to cross the Straits of Gibraltar and sail right into southern Europe. As these West Africans migrated into North Africa, they brought with them new L haplogroup lineages, such as L1b and L2a, and their various sub-branches. The L lineages originate in East Africa over 200,000 years ago and are largely confined to the African continent, there being 7 in total. These haplogroups are spread out from east to west and south, being numbered L1 through 6, with a special designation L0 for the Khoisan and Sandawe of East and Southern Africa. All other mitochondrial haplogroups outside of Africa are descended from the group L3 and are designated by the letters N and M, while L1b and L2a are native to West and Central Africa. These Africans quickly spread into North Africa, then sailed across the Mediterranean Sea into southern Europe. These new arrivals bearing these West African lineages would quickly spread throughout the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean, and like their brothers from East Africa who entered into the Levant, they took wives and spread their lineages. Today, L lineages appear all across southern Europe, in some regions appearing as high as 18.2%, and appear in places like Spain, Portugal, all across Italy, in places like Lazio and Sicily. The majority of these L lineages arrived in the Holocene during the age of the Green Sahara, instead of with later events such as the Muslim invasion of Spain. To quote Candela et al., the older period was responsible for the migration of approximately 2/3 of current sub-Saharan L lineages observed presently in North Africa. The results for the introduction of lineages into Iberia or Europe are similar to those. That is, a prehistoric episode would be the main contributor to the sub-Saharan presence in Mediterranean Europe and Iberia. A deep inspection of the L haplogroup founders introduced into North Africa showed most of them, including basal L1b, reached the area at the older period of migration. Compared with these L lineages that entered into Mediterranean Europe, the L1b root haplotype clearly dominates the pool of L lineages. More importantly, 79.5% and 81.5% of the lineages that suggest an early entrance in Europe also shows the same period of arrival into North Africa, indicating that the migration sequence was likely Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, Mediterranean North. These West African lineages were so widespread and pervasive throughout Neolithic Europe that they would eventually give rise to their own European-specific L lineage, known as L2A1K. This European-specific L2 lineage is found throughout modern Europe and is found commonly amongst Czechs, Slovaks, Croatians, Serbs, and Bulgarians. Every European who bears this haplogroup can trace their ancestry back to Western Africa. Every one of them is descended from those West African people who crossed the Green Sahara, crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, and will go on to make Europe their home for millennia to come. These migrations of West Africans into Mesolithic and Neolithic Europe are further substantiated by the actual physical remains of West African people who actually resided in Neolithic Europe during the Holocene. To quote Gonzalez, "Here we provide evidence of much older gene flow from Africa to Iberia by sequencing whole genomes from 4 human remains from northern Portugal and southern Spain dated to around 4,000 years ago, from the Middle Neolithic to the Bronze Age. We found one of them to carry an unequivocal sub-Saharan mitogene of most probably West or West Central African origin, to our knowledge never reported before in prehistoric remains outside of Africa. Our analysis of ancient nuclear genomes shows small but significant levels of sub-Saharan African affinity in several ancient Iberian samples, which indicate that what we detected was not an occasional individual phenomenon, but an admixture event recognizable at the population level. We interpret this result as evidence of an early migration process from Africa into the Iberian Peninsula through a western route, possibly across the Strait of Gibraltar. Here we used a combination of shotgun and whole genome capture (WGC) strategies to generate whole genome data from 4 prehistoric human remains and 13 mitogenomes from the Iberian Peninsula, dated well before any historical African presence in Iberia. We found one sample from Andalusia, southern Spain, to carry the sub-Saharan mitochondrial haplogroup L2A1, to our knowledge never observed before in ancient human remains outside of Africa. In addition, the analysis of the ancient nuclear genomes revealed an increased similarity between Middle Neolithic chalcotic samples from Spain and ancient sub-Saharan remains. To our knowledge, this study reports for the first time, both at nuclear and mitochondrial level, direct evidence of prehistoric northbound gene flow from Africa into Europe, probably following a trans-Mediterranean western route. And just like in the Levant and Southwest Asia, we commonly find sub-Saharan males buried in ancient Neolithic sites in Europe. As the majority of African lineages in Neolithic Europe were from West and Western Central Africa, we find a high proportion of individuals bearing Y chromosome lineages commonly found in the dense tropical regions of sub-Saharan Africa, chiefly haplogroup A. This Y lineage being synonymous with the deep interior of Africa and sub-Saharan Africans. One of the oldest African individuals we find in ancient Europe can be found here at Les Clissoles in France. Dated between 8290 BC and 7610 BC, this ancient African individual bore Y haplogroup A. Another African individual bearing this deeply ancestral African Y lineage can also be found in ancient France. This individual, buried in the Rhone Alps of France, also carried the deeply ancestral African Y lineage, haplogroup A. These remains dating to between 10,090 BC and 9,460 BC. Not surprisingly, we also find E1B1B lineages as well in Europe. Dating to between 6005 BC and 5814 BC, this ancient individual, found at Zuminica Cave in Croatia, bore the African Y haplogroup E1B1B1. And of course, we find sub-Saharan lineages throughout Italy, Portugal, and Spain. These locations being some of the very first inhabited by migrants from Africa during the age of the Green Sahara. At Salaparuta, Sicily, in Italy, we find one of many other Neolithic gentlemen bearing the deeply ancestral African Y chromosome, haplogroup A. This Neolithic individual, dating back to between 2800 BC and 1800 BC. These sub-Saharan lineages being found commonly amongst the ancient Neolithic remains of Europe. It's these Holocene out of Africa migrations that are also the cause of the prevalence of sickle cell anemia amongst Southern Europeans and throughout the Near East and Mediterranean. To quote Yassine, the Benin and Senegal haplotypes have been detected in equal frequency in Basra, Iraq, after the AI haplotype. This finding differs from studies done in north of Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Oman, and Egypt, where the Benin haplotype was found to be the predominant haplotype at 69.5%, 80%, 73%, 52.1%, and 80.8%. A possible explanation for the distribution of the Benin haplotype is that it had originated in Central West Africa and then spread vertically via population movement by trans-Saharan migration to North Africa, and thence across the Mediterranean Sea to southern Europe, Turkey, and probably to the north of Iraq, close to southern Turkey. Thus, West African people were a part of the founding populations of Spain, of Italy, and the Mediterranean. And that West African ancestry can still be seen very much in some of these regions, like Sicily. This is an Italian woman. This is also an Italian woman. This is an Italian man. For example, this is Russ. He's a pretty dope rapper, and you can tell he looks a little different from Northern Europeans. He has far more melanin in his skin. He has different features, curly hair. It's important to know when you see him rapping with Rick Ross, he has ancestors that look just like Rick Ross who are from West Africa. And not 40,000 years ago, just 5,000 years ago. Thus, whether it's the Levant or the Mediterranean, Africans helped found both the civilizations of the Levant and the Mediterranean. Now that we've covered those two, let's look at a place that has a very special connection to Africa, that being East Asia and Southeast Asia, and the relationship to both Africa and the Levant during the Holocene. These communities are of course extremely important to mankind. It's these populations that are going to migrate into new areas of Eurasia, spreading agriculture and urbanism to new areas. And while of course the Fertile Crescent is known for the earliest invention of agriculture, this Neolithic innovation would also be independently invented in several regions of Africa. Thus, there are several crops, plants, grains, fruits, domesticated animals, and inventions created deep within inner Africa that would find their way out the Green Sahara and into the Levant, and eventually into the broader regions of Eurasia, as African migrations out the Green Sahara occurred for millennia. One of the most important inventions of the Neolithic is the mastery of ceramic technology, or the invention of pottery. This technology being one of the most important and fundamental of the Neolithic package. So much so that the eras of the Near East are in fact divided into two sections based on the arrival of pottery, known respectively as the pre-pottery Neolithic and the pottery Neolithic. This ceramic invention having its origins deep in the heart of Africa, in the far corners of West Africa, being created in these West African regions almost 12,000 years ago. 4,000 years before this technology would eventually migrate into Eurasia. To understand this important technology that would eventually spread to Europe, Iran, and India, we have to understand the cultures of the interior of Africa during the Neolithic, during the age of the Green Sahara, known as the Aqualithic. Named after the aquatic environment of Africa during the Holocene, this cultural complex was defined by two distinct artifacts, that being wavy line and dotted wavy line pottery and barbed bone harpoons. This cultural complex stretches from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Nile Valley and down into East Africa. To understand the beginning of the Aqualithic culture, we have to start here in Mali, West Africa. It's here at Njugu in Mali we find the beginning of ceramic technology in Africa. It's here in Mali that these Africans would invent the oldest pottery in Africa and the second oldest pottery outside of East Asia, dating to 9,500 BC. Pottery is one of the most important technological breakthroughs in mankind's history. The pottery in Mali predates the appearance of pottery in the Levant by 4,000 years, and is most likely the source where that pottery came from, as African migrations into the Levant and Mediterranean during the Green Sahara occurred for millennia. It should be noted that historically the creation of pottery has always been the purview of West African women, their creation of ceramics being closely associated with creativity and fertility. Thus, it is to West African women we can attribute this large spread of ceramic technology. The use of pyrotechnology, the deliberate control and use of fire to transform earthenware to make pots, pans, cups, and pottery, is one of the most important inventions in African history. And many of these ancient techniques are still in use till this day.
African potters do not use kilns, but either fire on the flat ground or in a very shallow depression. Occasionally, potters will construct low circular walls in which they place their pottery, and the walls keep extra cold air from blowing into the firing. Potters use whatever fuel is available. They may use dry donkey manure, dry grass from the fields beyond their homes, dry bark that they collected while they were cutting firewood, or especially in the forest areas to the south, the dried midribs of raffia palms. They never use expensive fuels such as gas or electricity. All of the women in the community work together to pile up the new pottery in the kiln for a firing. If several women work together, each may identify her own pottery by some pattern impressed in the clay or painted with slip on the exterior. The fuel is lighted and allowed to burn freely. In Pellingyang, you see some of the women throwing pails of water on the firing to try to slow down the burning so that it doesn't get too hot too rapidly. They also take care not to let the fire spread to the neighboring brush. In a short time, the fuel has been reduced to a very thick blanket of red-hot ash. The pottery bakes underneath this for some time until it is a bright glowing red. While it is still hot, the potters hook out the pottery and dip the hot pottery in a kind of vegetable soup made of boiled up acacia seed pods. This process drives excess carbon deep into the body of the hot pottery, turning the jars from a bright red to a dark brown. This is very similar to techniques used in Japan and America, which are called raku. The process makes the pottery more suitable for cooking over an open fire and makes jars more waterproof. The process turns the red ferric iron, Fe3, into black ferrous iron, Fe2.
It's these early inventors from Mali that would take their new technology deep into the central and eastern Sahara. Arriving in the Nile Valley, the tradition of dotted wavy line and wavy line pottery would come to define Sudanese culture for millennia. While some have proposed an independent invention of pottery in the Sudan, the oldest dates of the wavy line tradition can be found here in West Africa, at sites in Niger, at Timet, Arjarbous, and Taglagal, respectively. This technology quickly diffused down into East Africa as groups migrated down into Lake Turkana, bringing their new invention. A special note is the early presence of barbed bone harpoons in Kenya before the appearance of the West African ceramic tradition. The creators of pottery at Unjugu, Mali, then migrated into the Central Sahara, where they would reside for millennia. This West African invention is not only one of the most important inventions in African history, but also one of the most important in world history, and a defining invention of the Neolithic era. To quote Hoysakam, "The discoveries at Unjugu, Mali, an open-air site in the Dogon country, shed new light on the early Neolithic in Africa. The stratigraphic sequence and a cluster of absolute dates established a terminus antiquum of 9,400 BC for ceramic sherds associated with a small bifacial lithic industry. The emergence of this typo-technical complex corresponds to one of the wet phases of the Pleistocene-Holocene transition in West Africa, most probably that of the climatic upturn at the beginning of the Holocene, between 10,200 BC and 9,400 BC. Paleo-environmental results, particularly archaeobotanical ones, indicate that the landscape was in a state of change, and that for several millennia, the surfaces covered by desert overlapped an open steppe with grasses, some of which were edible. This environmental situation allowed the dispersion of prehistoric groups over the continent, and probably encouraged a new behavior, the practice of intensive selective gathering, i.e. the targeted and rational harvesting of wild grasses for their seeds. However, not only must seeds be kept dry and protected from rodents, they must also be processed through cooking or fermentation. This process helps the human body to assimilate the starch, as the digestive enzymes necessary for its digestion are not naturally present. Ceramics would have been particularly useful in this process. Ceramics emerged in sub-Saharan Africa and seem to have spread toward the Central Sahara during the early Holocene at the end of the 10th and the beginning of the 9th millennium BC, while the desert zone became increasingly greener. The mastery of ceramic production may be considered one of the major inventions of African societies. Its discovery is far from being simply anecdotal. These societies facilitated from an early stage the management of wild grasses, both their conservation and consumption following cooking or fermentation. The data seem to suggest an invention to the south of the Sahara, around the latitude of the site of Unjugu, between the 14th and 15th parallels, during the climatic improvement of the early Holocene. That is, in the first half of the 10th millennium BC, or a little before. This invention is clearly linked to an environmental shift as the sub-desert landscape of the preceding arid episode gave way to the open tropical savannas, characterized by the spread of panachoid grasses and by changes to the range of animal species frequenting these new biotopes. These new ceramic-producing societies can be distinguished by characteristic bifacial armatures, perhaps adapted for hunting small mammals that visited these grassy areas. From this southern zone, populations advanced toward the central and eastern Sahara around 9000 BC, and it is possible that certain receptacles were initially copied in stone, as at Timet. It is worth emphasizing that the oldest ceramic remains are clearly scarce at the archaeological sites where they have been found, which indicates a progressive adoption of this new economy, whose precise objectives remain to be identified. Scholars can put forward, however, the hypothesis that the invention of ceramics could have been motivated by the new demands of a major period of climatic improvement. This equally allowed a high degree of mobility to populations within a wider area and potentially encouraged the adoption and diffusion of this invention by different human groups. Thus, only a little time afterward, from the mid-9th millennium BC, ceramic production was perfectly mastered in the central and eastern Sahara, as well as in the Nile Valley, where craftspeople diversified the shapes and decoration techniques, as can be seen at the site of Taglagal. Thus, across Africa, beautifully decorated pottery was produced and proliferated throughout the continent. This important West African technology would eventually find its way into the Levant in the 7th millennium BC. One of the earliest communities to produce pottery in the Levant is the Yarmoukhian culture of Syria around the 7th millennium BC. And not surprisingly, as West African women were the creators and purveyors of pottery some 4,000 years earlier inside of Africa, we not surprisingly find the burials of West African women laid to rest in ancient Syria. Dated to 6,800 BC, right at the beginning of the pottery Neolithic, these West African women were laid to rest in Tel Halula in Syria. To quote Fernandez, the aim of the study was to establish family relationship among individuals buried at different archaeological phases in houses from the Neolithic site of Tel Halula, Syria, from 8,800 years ago. 66 samples belonging to 50 different individuals were studied, and a fragment of 300 BP of mitochondrial DNA HVRI was amplified in the whole sample. It was possible to recover 20 authenticated mitochondrial DNA sequences. The site is located at the margins of the middle course of the river Euphrates in Syria, inside the Fertile Crescent. The studied individuals belong to 12 different houses from 8 different archaeological levels. Only one complete haplotype, 16224C, was shared between 2 individuals of 2 different houses. However, other matches were found among partial and complete haplotypes in 7 cases, highlighted in different colors at Figure 2. All the recovered haplotypes belong to major European haplogroups except for H37 and also probably H43, which could be assigned to West African haplogroup L2A. It should be understood that the movement of pottery from Africa into the Levant is further substantiated by the actual archaeological record of the Fertile Crescent. Unlike in Africa, which has a clear origin of pottery in West Africa, and has a clear spread into central and eastern regions of the Sahara, being accompanied with certain West African bifacial microliths and certain grinding apparatuses, this technology being adapted and diffusing across the entire middle belt of the African continent. In the Levant, pottery just suddenly appears out of the blue in the archaeological record. And when it appears, it is already well developed, elaborate, decorated, and very sophisticated, indicating it was an imported technology instead of being a local invention, as there is no lead up to this level of sophistication or development of the technology. While there is cruder, coarse, undecorated ware found in the Levant, which was once thought to indicate the earlier stages of this technology, these coarse wares were actually much later than the extremely fine and decorated ware that were mass-produced in early sites in the Levant, especially in Syria. These coarse, plain wares represent a divergent practice instead of the evolution of said style. To quote Olivier et al., The discovery of early pottery Neolithic levels at Tel Sabi Abyad and other prehistoric sites in Upper Mesopotamia changes the way we look at long-term evolution of ceramic technology in the region. Somewhat counterintuitively, it appears that following an initial stage in which carefully shaped, well finished, and sometimes decorated ceramic vessels prevailed, pottery production then shifted to roughly made, plain CMPT ware. Contrary to expectations, pottery production went from nice to coarse. And not surprisingly, the earliest finds of pottery in the Levant are these extremely fine, well decorated, and technologically advanced pieces of pottery. Found not surprisingly in Syria at around 6,800 BC, and not coincidentally, we find West African women laid to rest in Syria at 6,800 BC. To quote Olivier et al. One more time, the site of Tel Sabi Abyad in Syria offers a superb stratified sequence passing from the aceramic pre-pottery to the pottery using Neolithic around 7000 BC. Surprisingly, the first pottery arrives fully developed with mineral tempering, burnishing, and stripy decoration in painted slip. The expected more experimental looking plant tempered coarse wares shaped by baskets arrive about 300 years later. Did the first ceramic impetus come from elsewhere? The evidence gathered from Tel Sabi Abyad so far suggests no trial stage in which novice potters can be seen experimenting with their new technology. At Tel Sabi Abyad, the initial pottery Neolithic levels fit within a continuous, well-dated stratigraphic sequence. There is preciously little chronological space to allow for undiscovered intermediate levels. The earliest ceramic products seem to have arrived in a fully developed state. One very plausible explanation could be that the earliest vessels were not made locally, but came from some other, as yet unknown region, where the necessary experimenting had taken place previously. That as yet unknown region was, of course, Africa, as we know Africans were living in this region of the Fertile Crescent during this time period. And of course, we know these Africans were some of the oldest and most advanced potters on the face of the earth, having the second oldest invention of pottery in the world, over 3,000 years prior. Thus, one of the most important technologies of the Neolithic package originated in West Africa, and it's the migration of these West African people into the Fertile Crescent that's going to spread this technology to both Europe and Asia. These migrations of Africans and Levantines into new regions and their mixing with the local inhabitants would be the catalyst for civilization throughout Eurasia. Thus, just as in Neolithic Europe and Southwest Asia, there is an abundance of African genetics found throughout ancient sites and civilizations of the Near East in Asia, found everywhere from ancient Iran to ancient Turkmenistan to ancient Pakistan. And not surprisingly, all three of these localities would birth impressive civilizations during the Neolithic, namely Elam in Iran, the Oxus civilization of southern Turkmenistan, and the Indus Valley civilization of Pakistan. Each one of these civilizations began with the movement and spread of Africans and Levantines into these new regions. It's these migrants that would bring agriculture, pottery, and urbanism to these new areas. And it's important to keep in mind what the majority of these populations look like as people spread from Africa and the Levant into these new regions. A good example of this are the native peoples of Iran. Like indigenous people in Africa, or the Levant, or Neolithic Europe, or India, the indigenous people of Iran also had the ancestral alleles for black skin, possessing the exact same skin color they had originally left out of Africa with. To quote Brishak et al., we assessed the 5 Iranian individuals for whom nuclear genomic data was available, WC1, AH1, AH2, AH4, and F38, at a panel of single nucleotide polymorphisms. The Iranian individuals carry the ancestral darker pigmentation allele at most of the sites in the Hersheyplex complex, indicating that they are likely to have had darker eyes and hair. Reconstruction of the WC1 individual using the Hersheyplex tool returns the highest probability for brown eyes, dark skin, and black hair. Although the ancient Iranians displayed derived alleles at RS611-9471 in ASIP, which are nearly fixed in Europe, East Asia, and South Asia, examination of the eye and skin pigmentation loci in the 8-plex system suggests that the WC1 is unlikely to have had depigmented skin and irises. Thus, the first Iranians, or Aryans, were black. And of course, they would also see substantial gene flow from Africa and the Levant during the Neolithic. As we know, West Africans were living in Iran as early as 12,000 BC. These African Holocene migrations occurring for millennia. It's the spread of these people that are going to seed civilization in both Iran, Turkmenistan, and ancient Pakistan. The spread of these people and their technology being well attested and documented. To quote Gangal, "The Fertile Crescent in the Near East is one of the independent origins of the Neolithic, the source from which farming and pottery making spread across Europe from 9,000 to 6,000 years ago at an average rate of about 1 kilometer per year. There is also strong evidence for causal connections between the Near Eastern Neolithic and that further east, up to the Indus Valley. The Neolithic in South Asia has been far less explored than its European counterpart, especially in terms of absolute dating. Hence, there were no previous attempts to assess quantitatively its spread in Asia. We combine the available data with archaeological evidence to analyze the spatio-temporal continuity of the Neolithic dispersal from the Near East through the Middle East and into the Indian subcontinent. We reveal an approximately linear dependence between the age and the geodesic distance from the Near East, suggesting a systematic but not necessarily uniform spread at an average speed of about 0.65 kilometers per year. Of course, as these migrations occurred, people not only brought agriculture and technology into these regions, but genetics as well. Thus, there is a large amount of African individuals found amongst these ancient sites and civilizations. One such ancient civilization with large amounts of African ancestry is the Oxus civilization of southern Turkmenistan. In Turkmenistan, Iran's Neolithic neighbor, we find huge amounts of African individuals buried in ancient tombs from the Oxus civilization, these graves dating back over 4,000 years. These several African individuals were buried at Gonur Tepe. It's important to note the people of Gonur Tepe and the Oxus civilization would have a large effect on later Hinduism. Many of the rituals and practices of the Rig Veda were first practiced here in the Oxus civilization. One of these early African individuals is dated to between 2130 BC and 1948 BC, bearing the West African Y haplogroup E1b1a. This Y chromosome lineage being found commonly in Nigeria and throughout Western Africa. And of course, we find the East African E1b1b1. This Y lineage still being very commonly found amongst peoples of Ethiopia in East Africa. This African individual of the Oxus was laid to rest in his tomb between 2011 BC and 1886 BC. We also find massive amounts of the ancient African haplogroup A in men buried in the tombs of Gonur. These men bearing this deeply ancestral African Y lineage, now found primarily deep within sub-Saharan Africa, are dated to between 2500 BC and 1700 BC. And not surprisingly, with all these A and E lineages, we of course find the ancient African lineage of BT and CT amongst these ancient African men buried in this ancient necropolis of the Oxus. So as these Africans crossed through the Middle East and into Pakistan, they not only brought genetics, but also gifts as well. Namely a slew of native African crops that would become staples of Indian cuisine and culture for millennia to come. Agriculture being developed in Africa between 9000 and 6000 BC. More than 11 native African fruits and vegetables found their way into East and Southeast Asia during the Neolithic. Finger Malay, domesticated by Cushitic speakers in the highlands of Ethiopia. Pearl Malay, found in West and East Africa. The castor oil plant, which spread from the Horn of Africa. Cowpeas, or black-eyed peas, domesticated by Niger-Congo-speaking people from West Africa. 2 additional West African crops spread wide into Asia as well. One was a tuber crop, the country potato. It spread to India and across southern Asia, eventually as far as China. A second crop, the roselle, spread even more widely. Its rather spicy leaves have been typically used for sauces and soups, not just in West Africa, but in India as well. Hibiscus tea is made from the sepals of the roselle fruit and is drunken regularly throughout Asia as well as in West Africa. A fruit tree species, the tamarind, also spread from West Africa. This tree took on a particularly notable importance in India, but also spread from there further south into Asia. Sorghum spread even farther, far beyond India, all the way to northern China, where it became one of the primary crops of northern Chinese agriculture. The lablat bean spread far and wide as well, right across southern Asia to Vietnam and to China. But these early African migrants did not just contribute agriculturally to early India, but genetically as well. The presence of these ancient African founders, who originally came from Africa and the Levant, are also found prevalently in burials of ancient Pakistan. And the genetic footprint of these early African migrants from Africa and the Near East can still be seen in modern Pakistani people to this day. Pakistan is the home of the first great civilization of India, the Harappan or Indus Valley Civilization. Just as these lands were first populated by African people millennia ago, it would be Africans who would return once again to help them build this great civilization. As we know, West and East Africans migrated through the Mediterranean and through the Levant. During the Green Sahara, they also migrated into the Far East, and the populations of Pakistan still bear their genetic lineage. As we know, both D and E originate in Africa, and with these haplotypes comes a special polymorphism known as the YAP-positive marker. Anyone bearing the YAP plus marker has African ancestry. They are YAP-positive, while other Y haplotypes are YAP-negative. The YAP-positive marker is found throughout Asia, but the original YAP-positive marker can be distinguished from later YAP markers that moved into the Levant and southern Europe by way of the Green Sahara. Thus, we can date at what time the YAP marker appears. As Africans moved through the Levant, they brought new YAP plus markers into Pakistan. To quote Kamar et al., here we report for the first time the presence of Y chromosomes carrying the YAP element in Pakistani ethnic populations. We have determined the haplotype status of each of these YAP-positive chromosomes in an effort to identify their geographic origins. In combination with ethnohistoric data, these Y chromosome results support our previous hypothesis of separate migrations out of Africa for YAP-positive chromosomes and suggest that Pakistani ethnic groups have experienced gene flow from both sub-Saharan Africa and the Levant. The combined data are consistent with the hypothesis that Pakistani populations have been influenced by both migratory routes shown in Figure 4. Although it is possible that Y chromosomes carrying the YAP element entered Pakistan by means of recent admixture, e.g. in the last few generations, we favor a model in which Pakistani YAP-positive lineages originate primarily through more ancient gene flow. First, extensive genealogical information for each individual in our survey allowed us to exclude any known cases of admixture. Second, it is difficult to account for the global trend of YAP-positive haplotype frequencies and the genetic trails in Figure 4 by a simple recent admixture hypothesis. It's this genetic trail that illustrates the movement of Africans out of the Green Sahara and into the Middle East and the Mediterranean that he is referring to. As I said before, we can differentiate the older YAP-positive haplotypes from the more recent Neolithic ones. YAP-positive haplotype 3G is the oldest in East Asia and dates back to when Africans carrying the D haplogroup first populated Asia over 50,000 years ago. To quote Kamar one more time, the subtyping of YAP-positive haplotypes provides clues to the sources of paternal lineages occurring in the Pakistani population. First, it is important to note that no YAP-positive haplotype 3G chromosomes were found in our survey, although this haplotype makes up about 50% of the paternal gene pool in Tibet. This may testify to the strong physical barrier to gene flow imposed by the Karakoram and Himalayan mountains, lying between northern Pakistan and territory to the east. Thus, we can trace the Neolithic trail of migrants from the Green Sahara, carrying YAP-positive haplotypes, namely haplotype 4 and 5 and their various subclads, and see how they moved from Africa into the Levant, into the Arabian Peninsula, into Pakistan, and eventually into India. These Neolithic movements are most likely the cause for the prevalence of sickle cell anemia throughout India, which has millions of cases yearly and the most worldwide, second only to Africa. As we know, the sickle cell allele have a single African origin, and the majority of India shows the East African variant. To quote Schreiner et al., the Arabian Indian haplotype originated in Africa and had an overseas migration route from eastern Africa to eastern Arabia and then into India. In contrast, the absence of the Benin haplotype in the Luya in Kenya and the Baganda in Uganda provides evidence against an overseas migration route from eastern Africa to western Arabia. Instead, the presence of the Benin haplotype in western Arabia is consistent with an African origin and an overland migration route through northeast Africa. And of course, not surprisingly, given this modern genetic footprint and the prevalence of sickle cell anemia, we find large amounts of African men buried in ancient India. Multiple graves in Pakistan dated to over 3,000 years ago possess several men carrying E1B1B lineages as well as E1A lineages, which are some of the most ancient of Africa. The E1A lineages are the dominant paternal lineage of the revered Dogon people of West Africa. We also find individuals bearing the ancient Y chromosome AOT. This Y chromosome lineage is also one of the oldest of Africa and is now found commonly amongst Nilotic people of the Sudan. These ancient African individuals laid to rest in ancient India over 3,000 years ago, contributing greatly to early Indian civilization. Kumar et al. First proposed an African origin for the Yap polymorphisms of India over 20 years ago. His original paper, first published in 1999. The finding of these ancient African individuals buried in ancient India over 3,000 years ago, bearing these ancient E and D lineages, here confirms and validates Kumar et al.'s earlier thesis on the spread of Yap-positive polymorphisms through Neolithic African migration into India. So, as you can see, both the cultural and genetic contribution to East and Southeast Asia is significant, not only in the Paleolithic, but the Neolithic as well. During the Green Sahara, Africans are going to be net contributors to many of the civilizations of the Neolithic and early Bronze Age. The floodgates are open, and populations of Africans are all throughout the Mediterranean, the Levant, and Asia. This is the natural repeating pattern of nature. The greening of the Sahara is much like a heartbeat. As it dries, then turns back green, each time it pumps something new out. It's that first great greening that allowed our early hominid ancestors to walk out of Africa. It was that second green Sahara that let modern man bringing tools and art and culture venture out into the world. And it was the last green Sahara that once again let modern man come out of Africa, bringing new technology, new ideas, and new culture to the rest of the world. It should be understood that during the Green Sahara period, the majority of people are not what we consider white or Caucasian. The people that live in southern Europe are a mixture of African and Orignation. The people that live in the Fertile Crescent are indigenous Levantines admixed with Africans, the Natufians, as well as other populations throughout the world. The original populations on the earth are all melanated. They're just types of Africans, and that includes Europe. These were deeply melanated people admixed with African populations from the Green Sahara. The reason people don't look African anymore is because of the Ice Age, or more specifically, people in Central Asia during the Ice Age. They developed a mutation on a gene, and it basically turned off all of their melanin. As those peoples are from the Caucasus, we call them Caucasian. As they moved down into other parts of the world, they brought with them Indo-European languages, as well as that mutation for the absence of melanin. They mostly replaced and subsumed older populations in Europe and the Middle East. This is best described with who lived in Europe during the Neolithic. As we know, primarily West Africans sailed across the Straits of Gibraltar and into southern Europe. There they peacefully mixed with the Orignation people that lived in Europe at that time. These people would develop a peaceful matriarchal society. They were farmers and deeply spiritual, and like their cousins in Africa, they built in stone. These are the people that built Stonehenge. So, what happened? Around 3000 BC, the Yamnaya tribe came down from the Caucasus, from Central Asia. These people were not stone builders. These people were not matriarchal. These people were barbarians. They spread like a plague across Europe. The devil on horseback. They killed every single male of the Org nation, replacing 90% of the DNA in Britain and deleting all male lineages of the original peoples of Europe. This was the first genocide in human history. This is why people do not look black anymore. As Indo-European languages and peoples spread, it changed the genetic makeup of much of the world. The way people look in Europe and the Middle East today is not their ancestral state at all. But these migrations happened late in the Neolithic, only about 5,000 years ago. By that time, Egypt and Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley civilization were already up and running. This is why when people ask if ancient Egypt was founded by black people, it's always very funny to me. During most of the Neolithic, even Europeans were black. So the Neolithic was dominated by heavily melanated people, many of which came from Africa. This is especially true when we talk about the Levant. Much of that population came from deep within inner Africa. But with the exception of that one video of Cosmos where they showed the Mesopotamians as they actually looked, we really don't see depictions like that, which is something that really needs to change. In the same way I can find a documentary where people are talking about the Paleolithic out of Africa migrations with black people moving into the Arabian Peninsula, I should be able to find a similar documentary on the Neolithic and black people migrating into the Arabian Peninsula. Both migrations are extremely important to world history. The only difference is one is the beginning of all human cultures, while the other one is the beginning of all human civilizations. And of course, black people played an important and central role in both of those migrations. So those are the Holocene out of Africa migrations. And what I really like about the Holocene migrations is that it really ties the planet together. It really shows you how small the world is and how we're all connected. We're all family on this planet, on this small little globe. And we need to keep that in mind. So yeah, all right. Thank you guys for watching. See you guys next time. Peace.